All right. Well, this week we're in the fourth part of a series. If you don't know what a series is or you haven't been here before, we take this portion of the service, the teaching portion, and we usually group these messages or teachings in what we call a series under some common theme. And we're in the fourth week of a series, but don't worry if it's your first week, I'll catch you up a little bit. The question we've been asking that's been part of every one of these messages is, what's forming you? Like, what is shaping the way that you see the world? What's shaping how you feel? What's shaping how you respond? All of us, to some extent or another, are being shaped on a regular basis. It's not something that, like, we have a choice to be shaped or not to be shaped. We're all being shaped. And the question is, are we aware of it? Just yesterday, I was sitting on the couch with my son, Logan. He's 8. And we're watching YouTube. And we're watching this guy that he likes to watch who just does things that, kids on YouTube do, like just walk around and I think one video he's got a penny and he tries to trade the penny for something better and something better and something better. It's actually pretty entertaining. But my son loves this guy, and the guy just released candy. And he mentions the candy in the video, and my 8-year-old son, Logan, looks over at me. He goes, his candy, it has no artificial flavoring, no artificial coloring, and not a lot of sugar. And I was looking at him. Now, if you don't know my son, he is not interested in nutrition facts. But he's heard this guy say this over and over, and I'm like, he got to you. He's shaping. He really is being shaped by what he's watching. And in the same way, we're being shaped by what we watch, by what we think. So much of life is shaping us. When Jesus showed up, he showed up obviously at a very different time in history, but human nature was the same. And those people were also being shaped. They had different things shaping them, like the oppressive Roman Empire, but things in their lives were shaping the way that they saw the world, and Jesus wanted them to see it differently. And so in the last few weeks and this week and also next week, what we've been doing is looking at this tool that he gave his followers that would shape them and did shape them and changed the way that they saw it all. It changed the way they saw difficult people, difficult circumstances, the way they saw God, the way they saw what they lacked. It changed everything. And so we're trying to get back to that tool. And I challenge you, the tool is a prayer. I challenge you to consider praying this prayer 3 times a day, because that's what Jesus' earliest followers did, and it shaped them. It really did shape them. The tool, the prayer, you might have heard it before, goes like this. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. This was the tool that shaped them, that changed the way they saw everything. Now, if you haven't been with us over the last few weeks, maybe you're hear that and you're like, really? That's the thing? If your story's like my story, this prayer and all that it is and all the power and value that it has, it's been lost to meaningless repetition. I've just learned how to say it, when to say it. If somebody's saying it and I want to jump in, I could jump right in because the bounce and the rhythm and the way that it flows, right? It's like the Pledge of Allegiance. You know how it goes. And maybe for you, maybe it's similar. Maybe you get the prayer. Maybe you know it like the back of your hand. But maybe its value has been lost to meaningless repetition. This prayer had the ability to change the way that people saw everything. And if you're not someone who's typically in church, or maybe you're back in church for the first time in a really long time, or maybe you're doing someone a favor, or you're considering all of this, my invitation to you is just to consider, not to do anything, but just to consider, what if what if the stuff that Jesus says in this prayer is actually true? How would that change the way I live? How would that change the way I see what I'm going to face tomorrow? What are the implications of that? I'm not telling you to believe it, but just think, like, what if it is true? And so on week 1, we started this little challenge, little prayer challenge. Challenged you to try to pray it 3 times a day, and gave you this little video. We made this video that'll show you how to download the app on your phone so that you get a little alert at 12:30 every day. Be reminded to pray through this prayer. But for it to mean anything, you have to know what it means. So in week 1, we started out as like, our Father, you know this, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. What's going on there? For me, Father is a term that actually brings feelings of distance and formality. But for Jesus, when he used it, it created feelings of closeness and intimacy. People, religious people in the time that Jesus was around, they had a problem with how he addressed God as Father because it implied like, no, you're too close. Like you can't use that word to speak to Almighty God. But just like, no, this is how I pray, and this is how I want you to as well. To see him as a Father. Now, for you, maybe it doesn't bring up feelings of formality and distance. Maybe you grew up with someone who was supposed to be a father that didn't do such a great job as a father. Or maybe you didn't grow up with someone in the spot that you were hoping to have a father. Maybe it brings all sorts of complicated feelings to the surface. And for you, it's even more important that you understand what Jesus meant when he said, hallowed be thy name. It's not just religious words being thrown around. What he's saying is to start this prayer out, you need to understand hallowed means set apart or different. He's saying there's no one like him. There's no one who knows you like he does. There's no one who's patient with you like he is. There's no one who gets you like he gets you. There's no one who cares about the things you care about like him. He's in a category all on his own. He is the picture of goodness in every and the ultimate way. And that's how the prayer needs to start. Like you have to have a clear picture of that because we said your audience determines your approach, right? If you have a picture or feelings of God being distant or indifferent or apathetic or angry or judgmental, then it's going to inform how you approach him in your prayers. It's going to inform the way you feel when you say things. It's going to inform what you say. And so Jesus starts out with like, okay, first get a good picture of what God is like, that he is deeply invested in you, like a perfect father is deeply invested in his children. And then he says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now for me, for like always, these were just religious words in a religious prayer. It's like, all right, we mentioned heaven, that makes sense. Kingdom, not really sure what's going on there. And thy will, that just didn't make sense to me. But the idea is that the prayer, it's like setting the agenda. Jesus is saying, right, this is informing the way that he wants people to see the world. He's saying like, this is expressing a desire to have things in my life and in this world begin to look like God is the king. Begin to look like God is calling the shots. Begin to look like God's will or God's desire is being done. And you know what he says? And this is one of those things you might have to sit with for a while. He says, on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, this is a picture of what it's like in heaven. God's name is hallowed, his kingdom is coming, and his will is done in heaven. And that's paradise. This is the picture of what it looks like when things are the way that they were made to be. People see God clearly, and this perfectly good Father is calling the shots. And so we're invited to be part of this mission that brings these values and realities of heaven, like the way things were meant to be, human flourishing in its ultimate sense. We're invited to bring that to where we are in on earth as it is in heaven. Now, I showed you this thing last week, all right? And it's pretty, it requires a long explanation, but we don't have the time. So you might want to go back and listen if you weren't here last week. This is a big part of getting everything. But when we think of heaven and hell, we often think of these places that we're going to deal with one day somewhere out there. But Jesus spoke about them like they had influence here today. The way the story goes, in the way Jesus saw the world and how he wanted his followers to understand, was that there was a time when people flourished in the ultimate sense. In other words, heaven and earth were one. They were one. Like God and people were one. He was with them and we flourished. And I know it seems like out there and mystical, and if you think of clouds and angels and all that like fluffy stuff, don't think of that. The idea is like things are right. They're the way they're supposed to be. There's no restlessness within your soul. But the way the story goes, at least according to Jesus, is that something went wrong and there was a separation and an infestation. Remember these guys? I bet you saw a lot of these this past week, right? If you were here last week. They're invasive species, the spotted lanternflies. It's not actually them. I don't know if they were around where Jesus was. But the idea is that this is like hell. Like they show up, they're not supposed to be there, and they're wreaking havoc. And so the picture of heaven and earth that were at some point one, they're now separated and they're contaminated. Like God's space is here and there's us here with an infestation, and things are wrong and we're broken and we're restless and there's pain and there's hurt and there's suffering because of this separation and infestation. But then Jesus shows up, and if you get this, like so much of what Jesus says begins to make sense. When he shows up, his first message is the kingdom of heaven is here. It's near. It's at hand. And he begins, wherever he goes, begins to push out this infestation, the brokenness. It begins to look like this. Like if this is hell, Jesus is getting the hell out of here. He's pushing out the contamination and infestation. Everywhere he goes, you see things being reversed, right? And there are miracles, and yeah, sure, those are amazing things, but there's also just things happening in the human heart. Like you got a guy whose life is gripped with greed, and he meets Jesus, and he becomes radically generous. That's the idea of things being made right. And he's filled with joy instead of a feeling of lack. And so Jesus says that he was going to build a church, a following, a group of people, and nothing would be able to stop it. He says, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Meaning, the church is invited to be part of this mission to get the hell out of here. But in order to do that, he's got to get the hell out of me. And so I've got to deal with the things in me, the infestations within me, the things that are crooked within me. And that's the agenda. That's how this whole prayer starts off. Like God's kingdom is coming and he is bringing the realities of heaven to earth. And we're invited to do that, to bring heaven to earth, the values and realities of heaven to earth. But then, that's the beginning part. Then there's a hinge. Right? The whole prayer shifts. Sarah, let's put it up here. This top part is like the heavenly stuff. But then there's like an earth part. And this is the how. Right? You ever get like a big task and you're like, what? Like, how do I do that? Like, if you take this seriously, you should be like, well, how in the world are we going to pull that off? When I was in high school, I worked for a summer camp during the summer. And I was a runner. So it was me and two other guys, and we drove a golf cart all around the property. That was the selling point. That's why I applied for the job. But we would deliver lunches. We would empty trash cans. We would, drop off water coolers. We would just drive all around the campus, and it was amazing. We had way too much power with that golf cart. But we also had to do these odd jobs. And one day the director of the camp, he brings us out to the softball field. Now, softball fields, the infield is all dirt. And the outfield's all grass, right? Well, this softball field, the infield was all weeds. It was green. There was no brown. No one saw any brown infield, just all weeds. And he brings us out there. He's like, hey, guys, softball camp's next week. I need you to weed this infield. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm 16. There's got to be some laws against this, right? It seemed impossible. And he leaves. He's like, get it done. And I'm like picking. We get motivated for like 3.5 minutes. And then it's like, there's just no way. We can't pull this off. If you're serious about this, if you're like Jesus wants to bring realities of heaven, like the way that things are supposed to be within me and around me. Pretty soon, you're going to feel like you're weeding a softball field. Like, how in the world are we actually supposed to pull this off? If it's not just a nice, like, platitude we say when we're in church, but you actually try to do that, you will be hit with that feeling. And the how is in the next part. So he says, give us this day our daily bread. Actually, we go back one slide. He says, give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation. Deliver us from evil. If you know that prayer, you know the words, and you know what it says. But if you don't, or if you can pretend you don't, these are random things, right? Like, there's so much in there that could be in there. So much not in there that could be in there. Like, how about peace? You know, like, God, can I have peace? Let's throw that in, right? But for some reason, Jesus starts with lunch. Like, well, what are we going to eat? But it actually makes more sense if you step back and see and understand what they were hearing when Jesus said this. So he says, give us our daily bread. Bread is the universal sign of provision, or at least it was for those people, of God's provision. It was a staple. My wife, Allie, she's from the South. She's from Virginia, and she lives in Long Island, on Long Island. Sorry about that. And she's adjusting very well. But every once in a while, you see like little glimpses of like, oh, you're not from here. We had a staff Christmas party, and she ordered all this Italian food. Good move, right? Good, positive decision. We get like chicken. We got these big platters. She goes to the place to pick it up, the Italian place where we get this fine Italian food. And she gets to the counter, and the guy looks at her just like dumbfounded. And he goes, you didn't order bread? And she's like, okay. And he's like, I just put it in. Like, you needed bread. And she's like, okay, thank you, and like leaves. And it's like, you can't have all this pasta and no bread to like clean up the plate when you're done, And for him, it was like everybody needs bread. Even if you're not Italian, right, and you don't love bread, you get bread is a regular part of life. And for these people, it was a reminder of how God provides. This is the first direct address to God. If you go into like the formation of the verbs there, the first few things are actually like wishes. They're like, would this happen? Let this happen. But then this is a direct address to God, and it's an ask to give. And so if we're looking at shaping the way we see the world and understand God, Jesus wants us to know, first and foremost, God is a giver. God is a giver. Now, that's like, okay, sure, God gives things. We all like, if you believe in God, you probably are like, okay, sure, God gives things. And my mind's like, okay, God gave us a sun. He gave us like air. Like, God gives stuff. But really, if I'm honest with you, for most of my life, in my relationship with God, if there was one doing the asking, it felt like God was doing the asking. Like, I felt like I had to give to God. God has all these requirements, all these standards, and I've got to give him my time, I got to give him my energy, I got to give him this. And really, if I'm being honest, if I step back, it felt more like God was a taker and an asker than a giver. And so Jesus is like, no, like we start with understanding God is a giver. He wants to help. We're not expected to do it alone. And so really my question for you is, do you need help? Do you need help? Or in what areas of life do you need help? And do you think God cares? The words in this prayer, what Jesus wants his followers to know and remind themselves over and over and over again is like, yes, he cares. Like if I was on some deserted island or in, an undeveloped country and I had no food, like so naturally I would look up to God and be like, I need help for the hunger within my stomach because I have no bread. But here in the world I live in, like I could sit at a dinner table with a plate full of food and angry at the person across from me because I have no patience. And I'm not as naturally thinking I need help. Like we more naturally look to God, some of us, for the hunger of our stomachs before we look to him for the hunger within our souls. And the invitation here is like God wants to help. He wants to help with your lack of patience. He wants to help with your anger. He wants to help with that lack of satisfaction within you. He wants to help with your anxiety. He wants to help you when you're not feeling joy. Like there's a bread for that hunger. And Jesus is saying, go ask for help. Ask for help. Like this is the starting point because God is generous, right? If I was in a country with no shoes, and I had nothing to cover my feet, like I need help. But I could look at a closet with 90 pairs of shoes and no satisfaction and not feel like I need help. But Jesus would say like, no, let me into that. There's a bread for that hunger. He wants to help. There's this huge misconception in the church, right? And maybe you've heard it verbalized or maybe you just assumed it. I assumed it for years, but the idea is that I got to figure myself out, get my ducks in a row before I can go and like get right with God. Like I got to fix it up. And if you look at the words that Jesus actually said, he does not expect anyone to even be able to get it right before coming to him. Like the implication is that you can't do it alone. In some pretty extreme ways, Jesus was like, you can do nothing without me. And the like critical part of me internally is like, no, I can do a lot without you. But the idea is like, no, you don't have to do anything without him. We're not expected to be able to succeed, to be patient, to do all the things without relying on him for help. He says, the phrase is actually redundant. He says, give us this day our daily bread. It's like, okay, you could have just said, give us this day bread, or give us daily bread, But it's redundant there. This word for our daily bread, there's this idea in the phrase of what is necessary for existence. So he's asking for what's necessary for existence. It's less like daily bread, and it's more like Jesus is saying, ask for bread for the moment. Like if I'm thinking practically, okay, what does it look like for God to actually step in and help? Like, is this like a morning, like a little meeting where we set the agenda and it's like, all right, I got an 8 o'clock meeting. God, don't need you to show up there, but 10 o'clock I'm meeting with Tom, so I'm going to need a miracle. You know, like what? And the idea is like, no, it's bread for the moment. Like walk with him. This isn't like sending your kid on the bus and wishing them well to school, right? It's like getting on the bus with them. God is like, let me be there to help you. You know, a road trip is very different. Like my dad, like all these older men in my lives, my father-in-law, my uncle, like it seems like, and maybe not all of them do this, but it seems like anytime I'm going somewhere, they're like, let me just tell you how to get there. You know, and I'm like, I got a GPS, so I got to just tell Siri. And it's like, yeah, I know. But you want to go this way, down this road. It's like, okay, yeah. But like they can give me all these directions to start off with, but it's very different if they're sitting in the passenger seat. And there's an awareness of their presence that changes the way I feel when I'm driving. Like, am I going to need to turn soon? Is this the right way? And that's the idea. He's like, rely on me for bread in the moment. In the moment. Now, then he says something that seems a little random, right? This is where it starts to feel a little scattered. We're talking about bread. And then right away he's like, and by the way, forgive us. The translation here, debts, right? He says, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Or you may, like the translation you may be familiar with, might say trespasses. The word here is literally, it's a financial term, which is interesting because the guy who recorded this, Matthew, was in finance. He was a tax collector. And there's a picture he's painting here. Like, look at how this starts off. He's like, give, right? Give and cancel what I owe. That's bold. You know, like one end is getting the short end of the stick here in this relationship. But the idea here is that we can forgive, and we see this in other places as well, all throughout the writings of the New Testament. We forgive because God's forgiven us. There is a direct connection between what happens between me and God and what happens between me and other people. And there's a pattern. If you look for it, if you like to read the Bible on your own, which you should, it's fascinating, you'll see over and over again, love just like you've been loved. Give just like God has given to you. Forgive just like you've been forgiven. The pattern and the principle at the heart of everything Jesus taught is that God initiates and we reciprocate. God is the giver. He's the starter of the process. He gives and he's like, now pass it on. He loves and he's like, yeah, I love you when you're difficult. Now you go love that difficult person. We can say that my relationships with people are nourished and sustained by my relationship with God. Now you see these two words here? I use them intentionally. Nourished and sustained. You know what nourishes and sustains you? Bread. Food. Like this here, this phrase, forgive us just as we've forgiven, it's an example of what it looks like to ask for daily bread. Like give us this day our daily bread is saying like, help us with what we need. And here's where we're gonna need it. We're gonna need it in our relationships with people. We're being invited into an economy where it's not that we never mess up, because if you hang out at the church for like more than 10 minutes, you're gonna see people step on each other's toes. We got problems like everyone else has problems. The way that Jesus taught, though, was that we deal with them. Like we recover well. We reconcile when it's hard. We say the difficult thing because God was patient with us. God is patient with us. I've got issues and God forgives me. And so because of that, when someone takes from me, when someone wrongs me, the idea is that I can draw from my relationship with God to forgive other people. John was a close friend of Jesus. He wrote, we love because he first loved us. Like we're just passing it on. He initiates, we reciprocate. This is what help looks like. This is the bread for the moment. When you're in a situation and you want to give, but you're like, I don't know. The invitation here, the bread for the moment, the help is to stop and think, you know what? I have a supplier who gives. And so you rely on that bread. When you need patience and you're like, I'm done. You know, you stop and it's like, you know what? God has been patient with me. When you're out of love for someone who has just worn you out, the invitation is to be like, you know what? There's a God that I cannot wear out who loves me unconditionally, and so maybe I can pass that on. We often, if you're like me, I'll just try and muster it up. I gotta be the initiator. I gotta love that person. Just like, I gotta have patience. I gotta be kind. But what Jesus would say is no, ask for help. Come ask for bread for that moment. There's a bread for that hunger. There's a help for that need. But we're invited to go to him. Otherwise, it's going to feel like we're trying to weed the softball field. It's going to very quickly feel like this is too much. I can't do it. I gave it a shot, but I couldn't do it. Unless there's a third party, a source that is the supply here. The idea is that you can't do it alone. Jesus would say, you can't do it alone. You need my help. He said he was a source. The picture he painted was of a fountain, a source of water. And he's like, out of me will flow water through you to other people. But our relationship, at least the way Jesus taught, with people is sustained and nourished, is fed by our relationship and understanding of God. And so we pass it on. So I'll tell you a story, and then we're going to move on to something else. But for me, I've told this story before, but for me, one of the most practical ways that I've seen this was in my marriage, in my own personal relationship. So Allie and I, we were talking to a counselor a few years ago, which I strongly recommend everyone should talk to a counselor. we're talking to a counselor, it's a faith-based counselor, and we're talking through an issue, and I'm like, I just want to like get it right. And sometimes when we're like going back and forth, I have this like, I feel like I can't get it right. Like I just don't know what she wants me to do. And that, for whatever reason, it just gets me frustrated, and I'm like, I can't win here. I don't know what it is, and I just wish you would tell me, this is how you succeed. This is what I want from you. And I'm like telling the counselor this, and she's like, yeah. And she like turns to Allie, who's right there, and she's like, so do you understand the importance of communicating what you actually want? And I'm like, yeah, tell her, go, tell her, she got to say it. I'm not a mind reader. Can we use the word mind reader? And it's like, yeah. But then she looks back over at me, and I'm like, no, back to her. And she's like, yeah, but do you realize where this is coming from? I was like, what do you mean? She's like, do you know why you respond the way that you respond? Like why it's so deeply frustrating? No. But what we eventually got to was that there is a part of my value as a person that I find in being able to get it right. And she's like, it's good to get it right, but based on what you believe and what Jesus tells us, is that has nothing to do with your value as a person. And so you need to rest in that, knowing like, okay, there's a situation here, right? Like I'm trying to figure out what she wants from me, but who I am and what I'm worth, that is not something that's on the table. And she's like, you need to get that right first. And watch how much easier it is to sort out those practical issues. What she's saying is that you need to rely on your relationship with God to sustain your relationship at home. And it's way more practical than you may think. That for me it's one example of what bread for the moment looks like. And it's not like a once, oh, thanks for telling me that, now it's over. It's in the moment like, oh, here it is. And it rises up, and it's like, you step back and ask for help. Get some perspective. Now, okay, this is not about who I am and what I'm worth. It's about the issue. We can't do it alone, according to Jesus. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. We've done this before, but today we're going to take communion. And so I'm going to ask the ushers, the hosts, to come up. They're going to pass out some buckets, and there's no pressure to take this. If this is not something you believe or something that makes you uncomfortable, by no means, please don't feel any pressure. They're going to pass out these little buckets, and you can take one, hold on to it, don't take it yet, and when you're done, if you're the last person on the aisle, just put it on the ground. But yeah, you'll see these are the most convenient communion cups in the world. There's bread on top, and there's a cup on the bottom. So Jesus, he had a way of like looping things back into the story. With him, like things came full circle often. And the same is true when it came to the way he talked about his desire to help. He started off in the beginning with this teaching that he wanted to shape his followers, and he told them to go to God and ask for bread. And when it comes to our relationships, it's God's forgiveness of us that's going to allow us, that's going to enable us to forgive other people. And at the end of his life, he sits down with his followers, with those same people that were there that day, and he takes bread, and he breaks it, and he gives it to them. He gives them bread for that moment. And you know what he says? He says that it's a reminder to them of his forgiveness of them. And so he tells them to come together and to do this as his followers, to take bread he gave that represents his body, to remember that we've been forgiven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. And he sat at a table with people who trespassed against each other every single day. Because we need each other. Because we can't do it alone. And so today, 2,000 years later, we have the privilege, the opportunity of coming together and doing exactly what he said, what the church has been doing since it started. And so he took bread. Let's do it. He took bread and he broke it, and he said, this is my body, which is broken for you. This is how far I'll go to show you how invested I am in you. Do this to remember me. And in the same way, he took a cup. And he said, this cup represents my blood, which is going to be poured out so that your sins could be forgiven. And at other times, in other places, he would say that it's that forgiveness that allows us to forgive one another. And so he said, do this to remember me. Later on, a follower of Jesus named Paul said that every time we do that, it's like we proclaim what Jesus did for us. We remember what he did, just how far he went, just how much he gave. We remember that he's a giver, that he wants to help. And we can't do it alone. Not without him, and not without one another.